They said I was losing it, that I hid money in cereal boxes and stitched $100 bills into the hems of curtains, that I was losing my mind, not just my memory, and that I had become, as my daughter-in-law so elegantly put it, a danger to myself and the family's reputation. I remember the exact day she said it, because that was the day the ground started shifting under all of us. I'm 83 years old now, living in a government-subsidized senior apartment with beige walls and thin carpeting that smells faintly of lemon cleaner. I have a little kitchenette, a radio that only plays classical, and a neighbor who knocks too often, asking if I need anything, as if she's afraid she'll open the door one day and find me gone. I smile at her and say I'm fine, because I am. I wasn't fine then, when they took my house and my dignity under the pretense of love. But I am now. They called me paranoid for keeping my own records, for writing numbers inside recipe books, for double locking the door at night, for making notes of names and dates I didn't want to forget. But I remember everything, and that, as it turned out, was my salvation. When you've lived long enough, you learn that being called crazy is often the last defense of people who are afraid you've seen too much. It started after my husband died. Harold had always handled the paperwork, the investments, the insurance claims, the polite lies people tell banks to get loans approved. When he was gone, I started sorting through his files. There were ledgers in his handwriting, yellowed receipts from companies that no longer existed, and names I didn't recognize. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd lived through decades of inflation, recessions, and the slow, quiet panic of middle-class life. You keep things. You save. You hide a little, because you've learned that what's yours can vanish in an instant. Harold once told me, "Never trust a system that smiles while it takes from you." I didn't understand him back then. I do now. After the funeral, my son, Michael, moved quickly. "You shouldn't live alone, Mom," he said. "It's not safe. You forget things." I didn't forget. I just didn't tell him everything. The attic was full of boxes Harold had labeled in his code-like scrawl. Linens, winter toys, taxes 1975. But inside were papers, ledgers, old checkbooks, and photographs of people in front of factories I'd never seen. Some envelopes had seals, not from banks, but from government agencies that no longer existed. There were stamps from Switzerland, postmarks from Panama, and deposit slips from banks I thought were fiction. I tried to make sense of it, tracing handwriting, cross-referencing account numbers. The more I understood, the more careful I became. It was around that time the family started whispering. I overheard my granddaughter say, "Grandma's been acting weird. She thinks she's some kind of spy." Spy. If only she knew how ordinary it all was, how ordinary greed looks when it's disguised as love. Michael started visiting less often, but asking more questions. About the house. About the safe I kept in the pantry. About whether I'd made a will. He'd never cared about such things before. And then came the day he brought in the lawyer. My own son, who I had nursed through scarlet fever, who I'd driven across states for college visits, who'd borrowed from me to pay off his first mortgage, now sat across from me with a stranger and said, "Mom, we need to make sure your assets are managed properly." I smiled, the way women my age are trained to when men start using words like properly. I knew what they thought. They thought the old woman was slipping, that the quiet tone I'd adopted since Harold's death was confusion, not calculation. But confusion doesn't label boxes with 4 different handwriting samples. Confusion doesn't notice when the mail starts arriving opened. Confusion doesn't hear the whisper of a key turning twice in a lock that used to need only one turn. I was not confused. I was protecting what Harold left behind. Not the house, not the jewelry, not even the money, but the truth. Because what he left was not entirely his. It's strange how memory works when people start doubting yours. You begin to memorize everything, not because you're afraid of forgetting, but because you want to prove that you haven't. I memorized every number in that ledger, every transaction date, every name written in shorthand. And I memorized the day my son called me paranoid, because that was the day I realized I was alone. That's when I started writing to the FBI. Not in the way they say I did, not in wild accusatory letters, but in calm, detailed summaries. I sent them copies of the documents I found, the ledgers, the correspondence. I wrote, "I don't believe these funds are legitimate, and I don't wish to die holding what doesn't belong to me." I didn't expect a reply. I just wanted to leave a trail. A woman who leaves a paper trail cannot be easily erased. When the agents finally came, it wasn't like in the movies. No flashing lights, no shouted orders. Just a quiet knock and a polite man in a navy suit holding a folder with my name printed neatly on the cover. He asked if he could come in. I said yes. He sat at my kitchen table, the one with the lace cloth Harold's mother had made, and asked about the letters, about Harold, about my son. His voice was soft, cautious, the way people talk to those they think might break. But I didn't break. I told him everything. About the safe beneath the pantry floor, about the wall in the guest room, about the boxes mislabeled as tax receipts. He took notes, thanked me, and left. 2 days later, they were back with a warrant. By then, Michael had heard. He called in a fury, saying I'd embarrassed the family, that I'd fabricated stories, that I'd lost my grip on reality. He said the words slowly, like he was explaining arithmetic to a child. "You need help, Mom. Professional help." That was his phrase for the institution he was already researching. The next morning, he arrived uninvited, pacing, shouting, pleading. I stayed quiet, just as I did when he was small, and couldn't understand that sometimes the best way to stop drowning is to stop thrashing. I made tea, poured it into his favorite mug, and watched him cry out of anger, not love. That was the moment I stopped calling him my son out loud. I loved him still, but something had cracked, and I knew he would never see me again as I was. A week later, they moved me here, into this small apartment with its safe walls and its air of mercy. They said it was temporary, that they were helping me transition. But the truth was simple. They wanted the house. They wanted to control the narrative before the truth surfaced. They told the neighbors I'd grown forgetful, that the stress of Harold's death had broken me. I let them talk. I learned that silence can be a weapon sharper than accusation. I watched from the window as they boxed up my life, my curtains, my books, even my spice rack, and called it downsizing. I laughed quietly when I saw them lift the wrong floorboard, the one that didn't open to the safe but to the empty hollow beside it. Let them think they'd found everything. Now, sitting here, I understand the difference between madness and memory. Madness is when you lose the thread of what's real. Memory is when you hold on to it so tightly that everyone else tries to convince you to let go. They called me paranoid because I remembered. Because I saw what they didn't want seen. Because I wrote down numbers no one wanted to exist. But when the story broke, when the FBI announced they had uncovered $8 million in unclaimed assets connected to dormant accounts from the 1970s, no one called me crazy anymore. They called me something worse. They called me right. And that, at my age, is the loneliest kind of victory. It began, as most betrayals do, not with shouting, but with signatures. Papers slid across a table, printed on soft cream stock that looked innocent until you read the fine print. "It's just temporary, Mom," Michael said, his hand already hovering with the pen. "Until we sort out the financial confusion." I remember the smell of his aftershave that morning. Synthetic cedar and something sharp beneath it. Ambition, maybe. Or fear. The lawyer sat beside him, a polished young man with perfect posture and the smug calm of someone who believed in the righteousness of his clients. "It's called a conservatorship," he explained, his tone rehearsed. "Purely for your protection." He smiled, the way people smile when they're about to take something they know doesn't belong to them. I nodded, as if I didn't understand, as if my hearing had grown dull with age, and asked if I could make tea before we began. It bought me 3 minutes, long enough to open the drawer where I kept Harold's old ledger and slip a single sheet into my apron pocket. Just one. One sheet was all I needed to remember what they were really after. That morning was gray and humid, the kind of weather that presses against the skin until breathing feels like labor. The kitchen clock ticked with a rhythm that matched my pulse. I poured boiling water into 3 cups, stirred honey into mine, sugar into theirs, and set them on the table. Michael didn't look up. He was already pointing to the signature line. "Just here," he said, tapping twice with the pen like a conductor impatient for an orchestra to follow. I looked at him for a long time before I spoke. "You've practiced this," I said quietly. "You've practiced sounding reasonable." His jaw tightened. "Mom, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be." The lawyer cleared his throat, sensing that something unscripted was about to enter the room. "We're simply formalizing arrangements," he said, "given the evidence of misplaced assets." The phrase hung in the air like a fly over spoiled fruit. Misplaced assets. That was how they named my life's work, Harold's Secrets, the years of careful accounting he had hidden behind grocery lists and utility bills. I didn't sign. I told them I wanted to read it first, alone, in the quiet. Michael tried to object, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He knew resistance would look cruel. They left the documents with me, promising to return the next day. The door clicked shut, and I stood there, listening to the echo of their departure, the silence that follows deceit. I didn't cry. I don't think I've cried since Harold died. Instead, I brewed another cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, reading line by line. The words were clean and orderly. The undersigned relinquishes control of property, assets, and legal authority. It was a theft dressed in legal grammar. By the time I reached the last paragraph, I could see the outline of their plan. The house would be transferred for safekeeping. My bank accounts would be consolidated under a family trust. My medical decisions would be coordinated by my son. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Every clause ending with the promise of care, every kindness a disguise. The next morning, they arrived early, cheerful and brisk, as if we were preparing for a family picnic instead of the quiet erasure of a woman's independence. Michael brought pastries I didn't eat. Carla, his wife, carried a folder labeled Important. She had that thin-lipped smile that only appears when someone is performing empathy. "We just want to help, Mom," she said. "Everyone's worried. The neighbors have noticed things. You forget to lock the door. You leave notes for yourself. You talk about people watching the house." I laughed softly. People have been watching this house for 40 years, Carla. You just never looked up long enough to see them. She didn't understand. She never would. The lawyer arrived 10 minutes later, smelling of cologne and calculation, and took his place at the table. They laid out the papers again. Before they could speak, I opened my notebook, the one I kept in the bread box, and slid a piece of paper across the table. You might want to look at this before I sign anything, I said. It was a photocopy of a ledger page, just one, but enough to turn their expressions brittle. Rows of numbers, dates, and names, some with government seals beside them, some with account codes that hadn't been used in decades. Carla squinted. "What is this?" she asked. "Proof," I said, "that I'm not crazy." Michael snatched it up, scanning the page. "This doesn't mean anything," he said quickly. "Old records, meaningless. You can't just—" But he stopped. His eyes had landed on a familiar name. His father's, in Harold's handwriting, beside a deposit marked 1978, Federal Deferred. The lawyer leaned closer, his pen hovering uselessly. "Where did you find this?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "In the place you never thought to look." They left soon after, the papers unsigned, the mood brittle as glass. That evening, I heard Michael's car idle outside for 10 minutes before driving away. He didn't come in. I imagined him sitting there, trying to decide if I had truly lost my mind or if I had simply outplayed him. The next day, the phone calls began. Soft voices from numbers I didn't recognize, asking to verify my address, my social security number, my next of kin. Polite voices that stuttered when I asked too many questions. I hung up each time and wrote the numbers down in my ledger. By the fourth call, I understood. The rumor had spread. The old woman had secrets worth money, secrets people could trace if she wasn't careful. I spent that night pulling boxes from the attic, working until my knees trembled. I lined the papers across the floor, a map of decades, of choices made in silence. There were ledgers in 3 different hands, Harold's, mine, and one I didn't recognize, sharp and hurried, perhaps written by the man who had once visited Harold every spring, with envelopes and a smile too polite to trust. I found old passbooks from banks that had closed before my grandchildren were born, and letters from a law firm in Geneva, thanking Harold for his discretion. I didn't understand every detail, but I saw the pattern. Hidden money, layered accounts, transfers that stopped just short of legality. He hadn't been laundering. He'd been preserving. Assets belonging to people who had vanished after wars, after investigations, after being erased by bureaucracy. The funds were sleeping, and he had been their keeper. When he died, the task became mine, though he never said so aloud. That realization was the true beginning of everything, because I understood then that the family wasn't just greedy. They were dangerous in their ignorance. They would sell the house, hand over the papers, erase the traces of something that mattered far beyond us, and I could not allow that. I began photographing each page, storing digital copies on a flash drive I hid inside an old jar of instant coffee. I labeled it Sugar Substitute, in shaky handwriting. I wrote letters, one to the bank manager who still remembered Harold, one to a journalist whose mother I'd once taught to read, one to a friend from church who had connections at the Department of Treasury. I didn't know who would listen, but I knew silence would finish what betrayal had started. A week later, the warrant arrived. The agents were polite, almost gentle, as if they had been warned to handle me delicately. They searched the house room by room, photographing, cataloging, sealing evidence in plastic bags. Michael arrived mid-search, his voice raised, demanding explanations. "You called them?" he shouted. I didn't answer. I watched him walk through my house, the house I bought, furnished and protected, like a stranger touring a museum of someone else's mistakes. When one of the agents pried up the floorboard in the pantry and found the safe, Michael froze. They opened it, and the air inside smelled of old metal and paper. Bundles of documents, sealed envelopes, a tin box labeled key. Inside the tin were account ledgers totaling over $8 million in dormant assets, some private, some federal, some belonging to people long dead. The room went still. Michael stared at me, pale and shaking. "What is this?" he asked. I looked at the agents, then back at him. "It's what you thought was your inheritance," I said. "But it never belonged to you." The lawyer tried to speak, but his words fell apart. The agents thanked me for my cooperation, told me I'd done the right thing, that I might have prevented a scandal. I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I just remembered what others forgot." They packed the documents, sealed the safe, and left with the evidence. The silence afterward was enormous, almost holy. That night, Michael called again. His voice was smaller, stripped of certainty. "Mom, they said you reported this months ago. Did you know?" I didn't answer. I was looking at the space where the safe had been, a square of dustless wood like a scar. "You always said I was losing it," I said finally. "Maybe I was just losing patience." The line went quiet. He whispered, "You ruined everything." And I thought, no, I preserved it. I hung up before he could say another word. That was the moment the world shifted completely. The moment when my supposed madness became evidence, when my paranoia turned into truth. The betrayal was complete, not because they'd tried to steal from me, but because they had never believed me capable of knowing what was real. That was the day I understood the cost of being right. After the agents left, the house felt cavernous and airless, like something had been exorcised, but the ghost refused to leave. They had taken boxes, folders, the tin with Harold's initials, and yet, what remained was heavier than anything they carried out. The silence was a weight pressing against the walls, and even the air vents seemed to hum with a cautious kind of listening. For the first time in months, I slept without locking the bedroom door, though I didn't sleep well. Dreams came in fragments. Harold at his desk, the sound of a typewriter, a child's voice counting to 10 in another room. Each time I woke, the digital clock glowed a new accusation. 2:15, 3:30, 4:45. Dawn finally came, thin and gray, seeping through the blinds like diluted milk. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the rectangle of pale wood where the safe had been. The hole had been patched, but I could still see the faint outline of its edges. That square was a wound, and wounds don't close just because someone covers them. Michael didn't call for a week. When he finally did, his voice had acquired the brittle civility of a man pretending to forgive. "They said you cooperated fully," he told me. "The agents were impressed." I waited for the rest, and of course it came. "They also said there may be questions about the source of those funds. You could be implicated, Mom, if this isn't handled properly. You need representation." Representation, his new word for control. I thanked him for the concern, told him I already had a public defender assigned through the Bureau's channels, and hung up before he could rehearse the next act of his redemption narrative. That afternoon, I received a letter. Not from Michael, but from a lawyer in Washington. The language was formal, but not unkind, explaining that I was not under investigation, but might be called as a witness to confirm the chain of custody of certain materials. I folded the letter carefully and placed it under a teacup on the table, the same table where Harold used to spread his ledgers. It occurred to me that I had never once eaten a meal there without the presence of paper. My life, it seemed, had always been written down before it was lived. By the second week, the neighborhood began to change. I noticed cars parked longer than usual near the end of the street, sometimes with the engine running, sometimes not. Once, a man in a beige jacket walked past the house 3 times, pausing to adjust his watch each time. When I stepped onto the porch, he looked up, startled, and nodded before walking briskly away. I told myself it was nothing. Paranoia, the word they had trained me to use against myself. But the human instinct to recognize surveillance is ancient. You feel it in the spine, in the tightening between shoulder blades. It's the body remembering the old animal truth. When you are watched, you are prey. I began closing the curtains earlier in the evening, not because I was afraid, but because I was tired of being scenery in other people's investigation. I still went to the market on Thursdays, a small ritual of normalcy. The cashier, a soft-spoken woman with hair the color of nickel, asked if I had seen the news. "That grandmother from Oregon," she said, scanning my bread. "They say she helped the FBI recover millions in missing assets. Can you imagine?" I smiled faintly and said I couldn't. Fame is a strange thing at my age. It arrives disguised as rumor and leaves as pity. When I walked home, 2 teenagers were sitting on the curb near my mailbox, scrolling through their phones. One whispered, "That's her." Not loudly enough to be rude, just enough to confirm that the line between privacy and spectacle had dissolved. I didn't acknowledge them. I simply kept walking, each step measured, back straight, like a soldier marching through a battlefield of gossip. Inside, the air smelled different, faintly of cigarettes, though I hadn't smoked in 40 years. I checked the locks. The back door was secure, but the kitchen window was unlatched. Someone had been inside, or maybe I had left it that way. Memory, once doubted, becomes unreliable even to its owner. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing slowly, counting to 10 the way I used to when my children were small and about to lie. On the table lay a single object that hadn't been there when I left. A small brass key, old and slightly tarnished, with the initials HC engraved on one side. I stared at it for a long time before touching it. Harold Charles, my husband. The initials were his, but this key was not one I recognized. I had known every lock in that house, every squeak of the floorboards, every hinge that needed oil. This key belonged to something else. I slipped it into my pocket without telling anyone. The next day, I took the bus downtown, a rare act of defiance for someone the family insisted was no longer fit to handle public transport. The city looked different from the window, glassier, harder, as if everything had been polished to reflect only itself. I carried the key in my palm like a secret rosary. When I reached the old financial district, I stopped in front of a building that hadn't been open to the public in decades. Union Central Storage and Depository. The windows were boarded, but the brass sign was still there, dulled with age. I pressed the key into the lock of the side door, half expecting nothing to happen. It turned with a click, so soft it felt like breath. Inside, the air was thick with dust and time. The smell was unmistakable, metal, mildew, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. I moved through the corridor slowly, following the faint hum of electricity that shouldn't have been there. The building had power. Someone had been keeping it alive. Down a narrow hallway, behind a door labeled Archives 3B, I found it. A small, square safe mounted into the wall. It looked identical to the one from my pantry, even down to the rusted hinge. My hands trembled as I fitted the key into the lock. It turned easily, and the door swung open with the weightless grace of something long sealed and waiting. Inside were folders, thick with paper, each labeled with a name and a date. Some of the names I recognized. Men Harold had worked with. Men who'd vanished after investigations in the 80s. Others meant nothing to me, except that they were written in the same precise handwriting, the loops and slants that had once written love letters on my birthday cards. On top of the stack lay an envelope addressed simply, "For M, when it's no longer safe to stay quiet." My breath caught. I unfolded the paper inside. Harold's handwriting again. "If you are reading this," it began, "it means the work is unfinished. The accounts will be traced, but the intent will not be understood. Protect what is left until they can claim it properly. Do not trust intermediaries. The house was never meant to be permanent. It was only cover." I read it 3 times, the words blurring, then sharpening, then blurring again. So I had been right, and yet I felt no triumph. Only a quiet exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones when truth confirms itself too late to matter. I replaced the folder, locked the safe, and left as quietly as I had come. Outside, the city noise felt foreign, like listening to a conversation in a language I no longer spoke. On the bus ride home, I watched reflections in the window instead of scenery. Twice, I saw the same man in a brown cap, seated 2 rows behind me, pretending to read. When I got off, he got off. I turned a corner abruptly, and he kept walking. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. Fear, once planted, doesn't need water to grow. Back at home, I found the mailbox stuffed with envelopes, some from journalists, some from lawyers, one from a television network offering an exclusive opportunity to tell my side of the story. I burned them all in the sink. Fame, I had learned, is another form of surveillance. Michael came the next morning, unannounced as always, and found me standing by the sink, watching the last scraps of paper curl into ash. "Jesus, Mom," he said. "What are you doing?" His voice trembled with the confusion of someone who can't decide whether to scold or pity. "Cleaning," I said simply. He looked around the kitchen, eyes darting from corner to corner, perhaps imagining safes behind every wall. "They're saying you knew," he said. "They're saying you were part of it." I met his gaze, calm as the surface of still water. "If I were," I said, "would you believe me capable?" He said nothing. His silence was my answer. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table again and wrote a letter, not to the FBI this time, but to the journalist I had once trusted. "There is more," I wrote, "but it's not for the newspapers. Some truths are too old for headlines." I folded it, sealed it, and placed it under the floorboard beneath my chair. Let someone else find it one day. Someone who will know how to read between lines. That night, the wind rattled the windows, and I thought of the safe downtown, the one I had locked again. I imagined Harold's ghost watching me from some corner, amused at how long it had taken me to understand. The first escalation was not in the discovery of the truth, but in the quiet that followed it. The stillness before the next inevitable storm. When people take your sanity for collateral, you learn that silence can be more dangerous than confession. And so I waited. patient and alert, because I knew they would come again, not as family, not as strangers, but as the next version of the same hungry thing that had always waited for a woman's mind to falter before taking what was hers. The shift began on an ordinary morning that arrived without announcement, the kind of morning that would have disappeared unremembered if not for the way the light fell differently through the curtains. It wasn't even beautiful light, just a cold, slanted beam that divided the kitchen in two, illuminating one half and leaving the other in shadow. I was sitting at the table with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the thin steam rising from the mug, when I realized that I had reached the end of something invisible. For months, maybe years, my days had revolved around waiting for the phone to ring, for letters to arrive, for someone to tell me what to do next. That morning, I saw the absurdity of it. I had spent 8 decades being the keeper of other people's choices, the executor of their will, the custodian of their errors. Harold had left me with secrets. My son had left me with shame. But neither of them had given me a future. That, I decided, I would have to build myself. And for the first time since all of it began, I didn't feel afraid of being alone. I started walking again, first just to the end of the street, then further each day until my legs remembered what they were for. The city was changing, younger, louder, faster, but within its noise I found a strange peace. Nobody here knew my story. I was just another old woman with careful steps and a canvas shopping bag. In anonymity, there is mercy. I began to speak to the clerks at the grocery, the man who sold flowers at the corner, the woman who ran the bakery near the park. They didn't know my name, but they smiled when they saw me, and I realized how long it had been since anyone had smiled without suspicion. I found a cafe that opened early, quiet enough to read the newspaper without feeling watched. The owner, a woman named Elsa, kept the place running with the efficiency of a ship captain, and one morning she asked if I wanted to sit near the window instead of the corner. "Better light for reading," she said. It was a small kindness, and yet it cracked something in me open. Every morning after that, I came to the cafe, ordered 1 coffee and 1 slice of toast, and stayed until the lunch crowd began to arrive. It became my ritual, my small proof that I still belonged to the world of the living. One afternoon, Elsa asked if I lived nearby, and I told her I rented a room not far from here. It wasn't quite true, not yet, but the words felt like a promise to myself. That evening I went home, looked around the house that had become a monument to other people's fear, and decided it was time to leave. I packed 2 suitcases, filled a box with the few things I couldn't bear to part with, Harold's fountain pen, a faded photograph of my children before they learned to despise me, the brass key with his initials, and left the rest. I didn't tell Michael or anyone else. I wrote a note that said only, "Do not follow. The past has already been found." Then I turned off the lights and locked the door. The apartment I found was nothing special. 1 room, a narrow kitchenette, windows that faced an alley. But to me, it felt like sanctuary. The landlord didn't ask questions. He was used to people arriving with too little luggage and too many secrets. The first night I slept on the floor because the bed hadn't arrived yet, and I remember lying there, listening to the sound of the pipes moaning through the walls, realizing I hadn't felt this kind of quiet in years. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of absence, of things no longer pressing against me. The next morning, I unpacked my notebooks and laid them out on the small table by the window. I began to write, not to the FBI, not to lawyers, not even to Michael, but to myself. I wrote down everything I could remember: dates, names, codes, the color of envelopes, the way Harold's handwriting changed after 1982. I wrote until my fingers cramped, and when I stopped, I felt a lightness I couldn't name. Memory had stopped being a burden and had become a kind of evidence of life. In those weeks, I also started speaking with a woman named Clara, who lived 2 doors down. She was a retired accountant, tall and unsentimental, the kind of person who counted steps and calories with equal precision. She came by one day to borrow a screwdriver and stayed for an hour, talking about her late husband, who had left her with nothing but debts. I listened more than I spoke, but she seemed grateful for the company. The next day, she returned with a pot of soup, and from then on, we shared small routines: shopping on Wednesdays, tea on Sundays, small gossip about the neighbors. It was nothing extraordinary, but it gave the days shape, and shape is all a life needs to start feeling like its own again. She didn't know my history, and I didn't volunteer it. For once, I wasn't someone's scandal or headline. I was just a woman with a name that no longer felt like an accusation. One afternoon, while cleaning out my bag, I found the brass key again. It had been weeks since I'd thought about it, and when I held it in my palm, I realized it no longer frightened me. It was just an object, a relic of something completed. I decided to return it to the place where I found it. The old depository building was locked now, the entrances sealed, but I slipped the key through the mail slot in the heavy door and whispered, "You can rest now." That night, I slept deeply for the first time since Harold died. Dreams came, not of ledgers or agents or accusations, but of my childhood home, the smell of lilacs, the sound of my mother singing while hanging laundry. When I woke, there were tears on my pillow, not from grief, but from the strange relief of remembering something pure. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was from the bureau, polite and perfunctory, confirming that the case involving the recovered assets had been closed and that I was no longer of any legal interest to them. At the bottom was a short, handwritten note. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Carter. Not many would have done what you did." I read it several times, then folded it carefully and placed it inside Harold's old pen box. That, I thought, was the final entry in our shared ledger. There would be no more debts between us, no more secrets. I made tea, opened the window, and let the city noise drift in like a new language. Around that time, I began volunteering at the public library a few blocks away. It wasn't formal work, just reshelving books, tidying tables, helping people find titles. But it gave me something I hadn't realized I missed: the quiet order of other people's stories. One afternoon, a young woman approached me, maybe 25, nervous and soft-spoken. She asked if I was the same Mrs. Carter mentioned in the news months ago. I hesitated before answering. "Yes," I said finally, "but that's not the whole of who I am." She smiled awkwardly and told me that her grandmother had been one of the women whose pension funds were recovered through my information. "She said you saved her name," the girl said. "Not just her money, her name." I didn't know what to say. For so long, I had been the accused, the unstable, the unreliable. Now someone was thanking me for remembering too much. When she left, I sat there among the shelves, surrounded by other people's memories bound in neat spines, and felt something I hadn't in years: peace without apology. Michael called again a week later. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was softer this time, cautious. "I heard you moved," he said. "You didn't tell anyone." "You never asked where I wanted to go," I replied. There was a pause. "They dropped the case," he said, as if I didn't already know. "They said you were right all along." I didn't say anything. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know what to say to you anymore, Mom." "Then don't," I told him. "You've said enough." The line went quiet, and I thought that might be the last time I'd ever hear his voice. I felt neither victory nor sorrow, just a clean kind of emptiness, the kind that comes when something finally ends on its own. That night, as I walked home from the library, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. Streetlights glowed like patient sentinels over the pavement. I thought about how the world had continued moving even while mine had been paused, and instead of resenting it, I felt gratitude. I had survived being silenced, being dismissed, being rewritten by other people's convenience. And somehow, without meaning to, I had arrived at a place where none of it mattered. The truth had outlived its purpose. The money had been found. The names had been restored. The only thing left to recover was myself. And so I walked home slowly, not because I was tired, but because I finally had nowhere I needed to hurry to. And that, I realized, was the quiet miracle of being free. The piece didn't end with a knock or a letter. It ended with a whisper. That's how trouble always returns, soft and familiar, pretending to be curiosity. It began in the library, on a Tuesday that smelled faintly of rain and furniture polish. I was shelving biographies in the quiet back row when I heard two women at the checkout counter speaking my name, not loudly, but with that deliberate half-whisper people use when they want to be overheard without admitting it. "That's her," one said. "The old lady from the news, the one who turned her own family in." The other made a small sound of pity, the kind people reserve for tragedies that no longer cost them anything. I felt my spine stiffen, but I didn't turn around. The words were not cruel, but they had the power to reopen old wounds. When I stepped outside an hour later, the air had that heavy stillness before a storm, and for the first time in months, I felt watched again. At first, I told myself it was imagination. After all, paranoia is a stubborn companion. Even when it's no longer needed, it lingers, looking for excuses to exist. But within days, small things began to go missing. The mail in my box was rearranged, sometimes already opened and resealed. The manager at the apartment building said maintenance had not entered, but I found footprints on my balcony one morning after rain. My window latch was loose again. I didn't panic, not yet. But the old rhythm of alertness returned, the habit of counting sounds in the night, of memorizing the order of objects so I could tell when they'd been moved. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was recognition. I'd lived long enough to know that people rarely leave well enough alone, especially when there is money in the story. One afternoon, I returned home to find a card slipped under my door. It was thick, embossed with the name of a law firm in Portland. Inside, a handwritten note read, "We represent certain interested parties regarding the late Harold Carter's recovered accounts. Please contact us to discuss matters of inheritance." I laughed when I read the word inheritance. It felt obscene, like an insult disguised as courtesy. They had taken everything from me already. The house, my reputation, even the right to call my own thoughts sane, and now they wanted what was left of a dead man's shadow. I burned the card in the sink. The smell of scorched paper clung to the kitchen for hours, and when Clara visited that evening, she wrinkled her nose and asked if I had been cooking. "Just closing an account," I told her. She laughed, thinking it was a joke, and we drank tea while the ashes cooled. The next escalation was not legal, but emotional. Michael called again, this time in the middle of the night. His voice was unsteady, like a man rehearsing grief. "Mom, they're saying you still have documents," he said. "Unreleased materials. They're accusing me of hiding them." I sat upright in bed, the receiver cold against my ear. "Do you?" he asked. There was something desperate in the question, a mixture of fear and hope. "I don't hide things anymore," I said quietly. "That's your specialty, not mine." He exhaled sharply. "You think you're being noble, but you've dragged us all through hell. Lisa can't show her face at work. The kids are asking questions." His words were meant to wound, but all I felt was fatigue. "The truth doesn't ruin people," I told him. "Lies do." He hung up without another word. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint tapping of rain against the window, and realized that this was the first time his anger didn't shake me. Somewhere between the investigations and the departures, I had stopped needing his approval to know who I was. But peace is never given without cost. A week later, I came home to find a man waiting outside my door. He was in his 40s, dressed too neatly to be a neighbor. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked, flashing a badge so quickly I barely saw the lettering. "Just a few questions regarding the recovered assets." I stepped aside and let him in. Refusing would have only confirmed suspicion. He sat at my small kitchen table, flipping open a notebook. His tone was polite, but his eyes moved like a scanner, taking in every surface, every object. "There's been renewed interest in some of the transactions," he said. "Apparently, new claimants have emerged, and certain records are missing." I told him everything I knew, which was very little that wasn't already in the official reports. When I finished, he closed his notebook, but didn't leave. "Off the record," he said, "I think someone close to you might be reopening old files." He didn't say Michael's name, but he didn't have to. "Family can be unpredictable when there's money involved," he added. I nodded slowly, though the word unpredictable felt too gentle for what I knew my son was capable of. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of Harold's letter, the one I had left in the safe downtown. Protect what is left until they can claim it properly. Properly? What had he meant by that? Had I misunderstood? Was there someone still waiting? Someone the money was meant for? The thought unnerved me. I began searching through my old notebooks again, the ones filled with numbers and codes I had long stopped trying to decipher. Around midnight, I found it, a single line in Harold's writing that read, "Final ledger, C12, transferred under MK." Those were not my initials. I stared at the letters until my eyes blurred. Then I took out the Bureau's old correspondence and read every line again, looking for clues. There was no mention of any C12 account, no MK, no final ledger. For the first time, I wondered if the recovery had truly been complete, or if there was something still hidden, something Harold had buried deeper than even I had imagined. The next morning, I went to the cafe where Elsa greeted me with her usual brisk warmth. She could tell something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring coffee into my cup. "Not a ghost," I replied. "A memory that refuses to die." She nodded, as if she understood. When I left, she slipped a small paper bag into my hand, 2 croissants, and a note that said, "You're not alone, even when it feels like it." That simple kindness steadied me. I decided to visit the archives once more, even though I knew it was foolish. The depository building had been sealed, but there were other ways in. I found the rear entrance, pried open a loose panel, and slipped inside. Dust blanketed everything. The smell of paper and age was stronger than before. In the corner, near the safe I had opened months ago, there was a new padlock. Someone had been here recently. My hands trembled as I tried the old brass key out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't fit. It didn't. The padlock was modern, stainless steel, engraved with a code I didn't recognize. I took out my notebook and copied it down. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps above me, measured, deliberate. Not rats, not echoes, but human. I froze. The sound moved down the stairwell, then stopped. For a long moment there was only silence, then a faint click, like the closing of a lighter. I waited another minute before slipping out the side door and into the alley. The sunlight hit me like a slap, and I realized my heart was pounding so hard I could taste blood. I didn't look back. I walked until the city changed shape around me, until the buildings grew smaller and the noise of traffic blurred into a single dull roar. When I finally reached home, I locked the door and sat on the floor, breathing in the quiet. I didn't know who had been there or why, but I knew the game had begun again. That night, Clara knocked. "You're pale," she said. "Eat something." She brought soup, as always, and we sat together at the table. I wanted to tell her everything, but when I opened my mouth, the words caught. How could I explain that my dead husband's secrets were still alive, that they had outlasted his body, his son, even his marriage to me? Instead, I told her I'd had a difficult day. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're tougher than you look," she said. It was meant kindly, but it felt like a warning. The next few days passed in a fog of waiting. I stopped going to the library, afraid of being recognized again. I spent my hours sorting papers, shredding duplicates, sealing what little I still had into envelopes marked for the Bureau's archive office. It was a futile ritual of self-defense, a way of convincing myself that if everything was documented, then I couldn't be erased. On the 5th day, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a single photograph. An image of me standing at the bus stop near the depository, the date stamped in the corner from 2 days before. My name was written across the bottom in thick black marker. No note, no threat, just proof that I had been seen. I burned it immediately, but the ash didn't settle. It hovered in the air, gray and soft, refusing to fall. That was when I realized that I was no longer a witness to the story. I had become part of the evidence. The following week, the Bureau contacted me again, this time officially. They wanted to reconfirm certain statements and asked if I would come to their regional office. I knew it wasn't a request. When I arrived, the building was as sterile as I remembered. White walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of overbrewed coffee. The agent who met me wasn't the same as before. Younger, sharper, less patient. He asked about Harold's last years, about any remaining materials, about my son's involvement. When I told him I had nothing more to give, he leaned back and folded his arms. "Someone's been using your name," he said. "We've received inquiries supposedly from you, requesting access to sealed records." My heart sank. I didn't have to ask who. "We'll handle it," the agent assured me, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. To him, I was still the unreliable narrator of my own life, a woman whose sanity had been questioned one too many times. I left the office feeling both vindicated and diminished. The sun outside was too bright, the air too loud. I walked without direction until I found myself by the river. the same spot Harold and I used to visit when we were young and thought the world would reward good intentions. I sat on a bench and watched the water move, slow and implacable, carrying silt and secrets downstream. That was when I decided what to do. I couldn't control the stories others told about me, but I could decide which truths would outlive me. That night, I wrote a long letter to the Bureau, detailing everything: the key, the building, the photograph, the phone calls, even the sound of the footsteps in the archives. I ended it with one sentence: if something happens to me, know that the unfinished ledger was never mine to finish. I mailed it at dawn. The days after that passed like the pause between heartbeats. I kept to my apartment, waiting not for rescue, but for consequence. Michael didn't call again. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he was afraid. The newspapers stopped mentioning the case. The world had moved on, as it always does, but I had not. I began to feel the edges of my own invisibility again, the quiet dread of being both known and forgotten. And yet, beneath that dread was something steadier, almost defiant, a calm acceptance that I had done all I could. The second escalation wasn't an explosion or an accusation. It was the slow tightening of a circle, the recognition that even after you give everything away, the past will still find your new address. But this time, I was ready. This time, I would not hide or beg or explain. If they came again, I would open the door myself, not as a frightened woman, but as the last keeper of a story that refused to die. It happened quietly, the way most final reckonings do. No sirens, no raised voices, no dramatic gestures of redemption, just a gradual tightening of the air until every sound felt amplified, every movement deliberate. I had been waiting for weeks without knowing exactly what I was waiting for. Each morning, I brewed coffee, read the paper, watered the small plant Clara had given me, and watched the street through the slats of the blinds. I told myself that if I could predict the rhythm of ordinary life, I might be able to predict the moment when it would end. That moment came one Thursday afternoon, the sky heavy with unfallen rain, the light the color of pewter. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard the first knock. 3 times, not loud but insistent, like someone testing the strength of my hesitation. When I opened the door, Michael stood there. He looked smaller than I remembered, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed. Time had not been kind to him. The confident man who once lectured me about reason and responsibility was gone. In his place was someone brittle and frightened, as if the years of pretending to be righteous had finally worn through his armor. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I need to come in." I stepped aside, wordless. He walked past me into the small apartment, glancing around as if expecting to see the ghosts of our old life arranged neatly on the shelves. "You moved here," he said, his tone somewhere between accusation and disbelief. "You didn't tell anyone." I replied that he had stopped asking where I was. He winced, as if the truth itself had sharp edges. He sat down at the table and pressed his hands together. "They've reopened it," he said. "The Bureau, the Treasury, all of them. They say there's another account, one that was never disclosed. They think you knew." I felt the words like a slow, cold current moving through my chest. "And what do you think?" I asked. He hesitated. "I think you know more than you've told them. I think you're protecting something." His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw then that this visit wasn't just about the investigation. It was about desperation. He needed something from me, perhaps absolution, perhaps permission to surrender. I looked at him and saw not the son I raised, but the man Harold might have become if fear had outlived integrity. I don't have anything left to protect, I said. What was hidden has already been found. He shook his head. Not everything. They said there are records missing from the inventory, transfer documents from the late 70s. Someone used your name to request them. I knew what he wasn't saying. And you think that someone was me? He didn't answer. His silence was its own confession. I walked to the cupboard, reached for the old tin where I kept the last of my correspondence, and set it on the table. Do you want to see what I have? I asked. He nodded, his expression cautious, hopeful. I opened the tin, took out the stack of letters, and placed them one by one before him. This is all that remains. Every document, every copy of every letter I ever wrote. Nothing more. He flipped through them quickly, his eyes darting, his breathing shallow. When he finished, he looked up. You're lying, he said softly. There has to be more. There always is with you. Something in me broke then, but it was not sorrow. It was fatigue. The kind of exhaustion that comes from decades of being misunderstood by the people you love most. You think secrets are treasures, I said. You think they make you powerful. But they're just debts, Michael. Debts that don't disappear when you ignore them. His face hardened. You kept me out of everything, he said. You treated me like a thief. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. You tried to become one. The silence between us grew dense, full of years of unspoken accusations. He stood up suddenly, pacing. They'll come for you again, he said. You'll go to prison this time. They'll take what's left of your life. I felt strangely calm. Then they'll find a life already finished, I told him. There's nothing left for them to take. He stopped pacing and looked at me with a kind of haunted tenderness I hadn't seen in years. Why didn't you just tell me the truth? He asked. Because you wouldn't have believed it, I said. You never believed anything that didn't make you comfortable. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. I didn't come here to fight, he said. I came because they want me to testify. They think I helped you hide the final ledger. If I refuse, they'll indict me. If I cooperate, I have to give them something. I understood now what he had come for. Not reconciliation, but permission to betray me one last time. I thought of all the nights I had spent protecting him, the years of silence, the sacrifices no one would ever name. I realized that the kindest thing I could do for him now was to end the story myself. I stood, walked to the window, and drew the curtains aside. Outside, the rain had finally begun to fall, slow and deliberate, each drop leaving a mark on the glass. Do you remember the pantry safe? I asked without turning. Do you remember how it was bolted into the floor? He frowned, confused. Of course. There was a second compartment, I said. Not underneath, but behind, hidden by the framework. You never found it because you were looking down, not forward. He stared at me. Are you saying it's still there? I turned to face him. I'm saying that if the Bureau is looking for a final ledger, they'll find what they need there. I paused. But they won't find me. He didn't understand at first. His eyes widened slowly as realization dawned. What did you do? I smiled faintly. I mailed it, weeks ago, to the Bureau, to the journalist, to the archives. Every copy, every note, every name. I've already given it away. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He sank back into the chair, his face pale. Then why did you let me come? He whispered. Because you needed to see what it looks like when someone finishes something honestly, I said. You've spent your whole life waiting for permission to act. I stopped waiting. For a long time we sat in silence, the rain tapping softly against the glass. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as his mother, not as the old woman from the headlines, but as a person who had chosen her own ending. "They'll know it was you," he said finally. "They'll know you released it." "Good," I said. "Let them." He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. They'll turn on you. They'll say you obstructed, that you tampered with evidence." I laughed quietly. "They've said worse. Let them build their stories. I'm done with mine." When he left, he didn't hug me. He opened the door, hesitated, then said, "You've ruined everything." I answered, "No, I've finished it." He closed the door behind him, and the sound of it echoed like a gavel. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling an unfamiliar stillness settling inside me. I wasn't triumphant, just emptied of fear. For the first time in years, I didn't feel hunted or doubted. I walked to the small desk by the window, took out a sheet of paper, and began to write. Not a confession, not a plea, but a statement of fact. The ledger was never about money, I wrote. It was about memory. I kept it because someone had to remember what was erased. I signed it with my full name, the way Harold used to sign contracts, and placed it in an envelope addressed to the Bureau's evidence office. That night, I slept deeply, without dreams. In the morning, the sky was clear, the air cool. I walked to the post office, mailed the envelope, and then continued to the park. The city was awake, alive with its usual indifference. Children were playing near the fountain, their laughter sharp and bright. I sat on a bench and watched them, thinking of how every generation inherits both the lies and the silences of the one before. Maybe that was what Harold had understood, that the only way to break the cycle was to expose it completely, no matter the cost. I had done that now. Whatever came next was no longer my concern. When I returned home, there was a message on my answering machine. A woman's voice, measured and professional. "Mrs. Carter, this is Special Agent Reeves. We've received your materials. I believe you've resolved more than you realize. I'd like to thank you, personally." Her tone was formal, but not cold. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, a fragile kind of pride. I erased the message without replaying it. I didn't need gratitude. What I wanted, finally, was silence. The kind that isn't imposed by others, but chosen freely. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, I lit a single candle on the table. Its flame reflected in the window, small and steady. I thought of Harold, of the ledger, of the long road from fear to clarity. The house, the money, the family, the bureau. All of it seemed distant now, like chapters from someone else's story. What remained was the simple, unremarkable truth that I had done what needed to be done. For once, I didn't doubt my memory or question my sanity. I sat there in the dim light, listening to the faint hum of the city, and realized that the end of the story wasn't destruction or redemption. It was release. A quiet, irreversible act of freedom, carried out not in defiance, but in completion. Morning arrived gently, as if the world itself had decided to forgive me. The first thing I noticed was the light, soft and colorless, spreading slowly across the room like a new beginning that didn't need to announce itself. I lay in bed for a long time, listening to the small sounds that made up my life. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant rhythm of footsteps from the hallway, the faint rustle of the curtains when the window caught a breath of wind. For the first time in years, I felt no need to prepare, to anticipate, to guard myself. Everything that had needed to be said or done had already crossed into the hands of others. My role in the story was over, and with that realization came a stillness that felt almost like grace. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street below. Clara was already outside, watering the potted geraniums on her balcony. She waved when she saw me, and I waved back. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. There was comfort in the quiet knowledge that life, in its small domestic persistence, continues, whether we are ready for it or not. I thought of how much of my life had been spent fighting for the right to be believed, to be seen as coherent, rational, truthful. And now that the truth had outlived all the noise, I felt no triumph, only a deep, cleansing fatigue. People imagine peace as a feeling of joy, but in truth, it is more like the slow exhale after years of holding your breath. Later that morning, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The streets were wet from the previous night's rain, the pavement shimmering with reflections of clouds. Children passed me on bicycles, laughing, their voices echoing off the walls. A man was painting his fence, and a woman called from a porch for her dog to come inside. It all seemed impossibly simple, this ordinary rhythm of existence, and for a moment I felt the weight of how long I had lived outside it. I had spent too many years inside a story that belonged to someone else, a story about deception and suspicion, about what an old woman could or could not know. But as I walked beneath the budding trees, I understood that I was finally beyond the reach of their versions. I was no longer the woman who had to prove she remembered. I was the woman who had remembered too much and survived it. When I reached the park, I sat on the same bench where I had waited for Harold decades ago, when we were still young and full of untested dreams. The bench had been replaced at least twice since then, but I like to think that memory leaves its own kind of indentation, invisible but real. I closed my eyes and let the wind carry the smell of grass and wet earth toward me. I thought about Harold, about how much of him I had hated and loved in equal measure, how his secrets had both destroyed and preserved me. I understood now that he had not meant to burden me. He had given me what he could not finish, believing that I, with my quiet patience, might one day bring the chaos to rest. I had resented him for it for so long, but sitting there, I realized that it had also kept me alive. The task of remembering had been both curse and anchor. Without it, I might have faded long ago into the polite invisibility reserved for old women whose usefulness has expired. A little girl ran past me chasing a red balloon, and when she stumbled, I caught it before it floated away. She smiled shyly and said, "Thank you," before running back to her mother. I watched them go and felt something ease inside me. There was no metaphor in that moment, no lesson. It was simply life returning to its natural state, one generation letting go, another taking hold. I had done my part in the endless relay of keeping things intact, of holding the truth until it found its rightful owner. Now it belonged to others, to history, to the bureaucrats and the journalists and the strangers who would turn it into words and numbers on paper. I was free to be small again, to exist without purpose. When I returned home, there was an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a copy of the one the Bureau had taken the day they collected the last of the evidence. In it, I was standing at the door of my old house, holding the ledger in both hands, my face half in shadow. On the back, someone had written, "You did the right thing." No signature, just that. I set the photo on the table, made another cup of coffee, and sat with it for a while. It felt strange to see myself captured in that frozen moment, the woman I had been before release, before peace, before this quiet morning. I didn't know who had sent it or why, but I decided it didn't matter. The photograph was no longer evidence. It was simply proof that I had existed, that I had lived through something that had tried to erase me. As the afternoon faded, Clara knocked softly on my door. She brought a small plate of shortbread cookies and asked if I wanted to join her for tea. We sat on her balcony, watching the city settle into evening, the light turning gold on the rooftops. She told me about her niece's graduation, about a neighbor's new cat, about things that had no weight beyond the comfort of being ordinary. I listened, grateful for the sound of a human voice that wasn't questioning or suspicious. When I finally returned to my apartment, the sky was already darkening. I lit a single lamp and opened the window to let in the cool air. The city smelled faintly of rain and dust, and somewhere a radio played an old song I hadn't heard in years. Before bed, I took out my last notebook, the one I had not given to anyone, and wrote a single line across the first clean page. Some debts are paid not in money, but in memory. I closed it, tied it with a thin piece of string, and placed it inside the drawer of my nightstand. It wasn't a secret, only a reminder, a quiet message for whoever might find it one day. I thought of all the women I had known, silenced in different ways, by kindness, by ridicule, by dismissal. And I wished I could tell them that survival is sometimes quieter than justice, that peace is not the same as victory, but it is enough. As I turned off the light, I looked once more at the photograph on the table. The woman in it seemed distant, almost unrecognizable, yet I felt no sadness for her. She had done what needed to be done. She had remembered. She had spoken. She had endured. And now she had earned her silence. I lay down and closed my eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breath. Outside, the city murmured its endless lullaby, indifferent and alive. I thought of the ledger, of Harold, of Michael, of every line of every story that had passed through my hands, and for the first time, none of it felt unfinished. The world no longer owed me understanding, and I no longer owed it explanation. I was simply here, still breathing, still whole, and in that quiet, unremarkable moment, I understood that freedom was never about escape. It was about arrival.